You are attending a school for wizards, where they learn to do magic. You are terrible at doing the steps to cast spells, but to everyone's anger it keeps working and you can spell cast no problem. Unknown to you, and everyone else, this is because you are actually a sorcerer. Wendell was the worst wizard student anyone had ever seen. Professor Orion had always believed that anyone could learn magic, but watching Wendell struggle, he was beginning to have doubts. The boy fumbled his wand, tripped over his robes, and mumbled incantations like he had a mouthful of marbles. When his words could be understood, they were usually the wrong ones. Knowing all this, Professor Orion was astounded. The boy who shouldn't have been able to magic up a spark to start a campfire was currently blasting a volcanic eruption from the end of his wand. The target he had aimed at was gone. So was the wall behind it, and a portion of the mountain beyond that. The forest was now ablaze. Wendell turned to the professor, beaming. "How was that?" he asked, either unaware or uncaring of the thick smoke now filling the air. Professor Orion shook his head, gripping his clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had hoped to expel Wendell during this test. If he could prove the boy was incompetent, he could remove him from the esteemed grounds of Higher Latency Magic Academy. But after such a display of raw talent, the professor clenched his fists, crumpling the sheet in his hands. Top marks, yet again. Wendell had failed the incantation and gestures, parts that should have made the spell fizzle out. The student should have been expelled. Yet here he stood, top of his class, despite failing a quarter of the test. Next. Professor Orion barked, ignoring Wendell and scowling at the smoldering remains of the forest. Somehow, that boy had the best control and power of anyone the school had ever seen. As Wendell walked away he beamed. He had seen the mark the professor had given him. He hadn't known he was so good at magic. Then again, as he watched the others struggle, he didn't understand why magic wasn't as easy for them. Some of their spells even failed mid-cast, yet he never had that problem. He shrugged and grinned, pleased with himself. He had never earned top marks on anything before. In fact, he felt he was doing better than his family expected. The next test, a test of illusion, had Professor Grimwhistle watching Wendell with a keen eye. Everyone in the class could do this spell. It was the simplest illusion they had learned, conjuring a butterfly. Wendell's wand movements were erratic, and his incantation was a jumbled mess, barely understandable. Yet, somehow, at the end of it, Wendell produced the most beautiful, lifelike butterfly. It fluttered about the room, iridescent wings glinting in the light. Professor Grimwhistle squinted, walking over to touch the butterfly to ensure Wendell hadn't found a way to sneak a real butterfly in. The rest of the class groaned in unison, glaring at Wendell. They had spent hours practicing, studying, perfecting their craft. Wendell, meanwhile, seemed to stumble through magic like a drunk in a crystal shop, knocking things over and somehow ending up with a perfect sculpture. Professor Grimwhistle's pen tore the parchment as he marked Wendell's score. Top marks, again. The unfairness of it all made his teeth grind. He glanced back to the boy and sighed. Somehow, through several semesters, Wendell had managed to remain top of his class. Wendell couldn't understand why everyone else looked so miserable. He thought everyone was doing great. "That's a really nice butterfly, Sandra," he called out, genuinely impressed with the next student. She glared at him, eye twitching in response. In potions class, Professor Snell kept a close eye on him, expecting the worst. After all, potions were nothing like spellcasting, and if one were to fling things into the cauldron willy-nilly, it could be extraordinarily dangerous. "Today, we will be concocting a basic healing draft," Professor Snell announced, his beady eyes narrowing as they zeroed in on Wendell. "Follow the instructions exactly." Wendell saluted as he cracked open the book to the healing section. It read exactly like a cookbook. First, the ingredients. A cup of fresh spring water, a spoonful of mandrake root, a tablespoon of ground butterfly wing, and 2 blue mountain flowers. Wendell laid all the ingredients out before him and closed his book. "It's just like making soup," he excitedly said to himself. As students carefully measured ingredients, and mixed the recipe, referring to the book regularly, Wendell merely let the water boil. He began adding ingredients, smelled the potion, and added a little more. When the professor turned back around, his eyes widened to see Wendell not only add a tablespoon of butterfly wing, but the entire container emptied into his cauldron. "Wendell!" the professor shouted. Wendell glanced up just as his concoction exploded, a thick purple smoke erupting into the air. Children began choking and coughing. The professor stomped over. However, he froze. The air filled with the scent of copper and lavender. His back and hip began to feel better. He straightened his posture for the first time in years. The children all froze, staring at the professor. He frowned, wondering what had caught their attention so, until he felt it. His bald scalp was itchy. When he went to scratch, he found an inch of hair had grown. The professor stared intently at the cauldron. "What did you do?" Wendell shrugged. "It's how I cook at home. You just add a little, taste it and add more until it tastes right." Professor Snell glanced at the ingredients. "Powdered dragon scale? Lavender? Honey? What is this?" Wendell smiled broadly. "It's what I used at home to cure my dad's cold, though turns out it wasn't a cold, it was cancer. But it was gone after that." The students gaped at him. "Cancer?" one girl whispered, her voice filled with awe. This was a constant throughout Wendell's academic career. Somehow, even after screwing up in the most ridiculous fashion, he was still able to complete whatever task was set before him. The truth, unknown to him and everyone else, was that Wendell wasn't a wizard at all. He was, in fact, a sorcerer, born with innate magical abilities that didn't rely on wands, incantations, or learning. His magic didn't come from study or practice, it came from within. He could no more control it than he could control his own heartbeat. Magic simply happened around him. The end of the year arrived, and the Academy held its annual award ceremony. Students and faculty gathered in the grand hall, a murmur of anticipation filling the air. Wendell, oblivious to the envious glares from his peers, sat in the front row, fidgeting with a stain on his robe. The headmaster, a stern man with a long brown beard, stood at the podium. And now, he announced, for the award of Most Outstanding Student in Magic, we honor Wendell. The hall erupted in applause, though the cheering was strained. Wendell stood up, blushing furiously, and made his way to the stage. He accepted the ornate crystal trophy with a grin, feeling on top of the world. As he held the trophy aloft, he thought it would be nice to give a speech. He cleared his throat, not realizing he was holding a powerful magical artifact. Thanks, everyone. I never thought I'd be here. This is just like magic. He grinned goofily. In his excitement, he waved the trophy around. To his surprise, the trophy began to glow. A beam of light shot from the crystal, enveloping the entire hall. The audience gasped as flowers began to bloom everywhere, roses, lilies, sunflowers, bursting forth from the stone floor, covering every inch of the hall in a riot of color and fragrance. Vines wrapped around the pillars, blossoms sprouted from the ceiling, and even the headmaster found himself holding a bouquet of daisies. The entire room was transformed into a magnificent, enchanted garden. The crowd stared in awe, then erupted into laughter and applause. How did he do that? Someone whispered. It's beautiful. Wendell blinked in confusion. You're welcome? He said, looking at the sea of flowers surrounding him. Professor Orion, watching from the back of the hall, facepalmed. Somehow, Wendell had done it again.